It was an ordinary afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of day where the sun filters lazily through the trees and life seems to move just a little bit slower. Jaden, a bright-eyed 19-year-old, had just wrapped up his shift at the local community center. He was in high spirits, proud of the work he'd done mentoring kids that week. The car waiting for him in the parking lot wasn't flashy or brand new. It was his late grandmother's old sedan, a little beat up but full of memories. To Jaden, it was priceless. He jingled the keys in his hand, the sound cutting through the soft hum of the afternoon. Sliding into the driver's seat, he smiled to himself, thinking about getting home, kicking off his shoes, and settling in for the weekend. But as he adjusted his mirrors and buckled his seatbelt, he noticed something unusual in the rearview mirror. A patrol car was parked across the street, its engine idling. At first, Jaden didn't think much of it. Maybe the officer was on a routine patrol. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, the squad car's headlights flicked on, and it followed him, maintaining a steady distance. Jaden's pulse quickened. He had heard stories, plenty of them, about young black men being stopped for no reason. Still, he told himself not to overthink it. Maybe the officer was headed somewhere else. As he turned onto the main road, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated his mirrors, and a sharp, shrill siren pierced the air. His heart sank. He pulled over, careful to keep his hands on the wheel, just like his mom had always taught him. The officer, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, approached the car. His hand hovered near his holster, and his gaze was hard and unflinching. "License and registration," the cop barked. Jaden nodded, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Sure thing, officer. My wallet's in my pocket. Is it okay if I reach for it?" The officer gave a curt nod but didn't say a word. Jaden handed over his license and reached into the glove compartment for the registration. Everything was in order: his name, his address, even the car insurance. But as the officer scanned the documents, his frown deepened. "Step out of the car," the officer demanded. Confused, Jaden hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. "I said, step out of the car," the cop repeated, louder this time, his tone sharp enough to cut through steel. Jaden complied, his mind racing. He stood by the roadside, the asphalt radiating heat beneath his sneakers, as the officer began questioning him. The accusations came fast and without warning. "This car doesn't belong to you," the cop said flatly. "What?" "Yes, it does," Jaden replied, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "I just gave you the registration. It's in my name." But the officer wasn't buying it. He called for backup, and within minutes, another squad car arrived. Neighbors began peeking out of their windows, some stepping onto their porches to see what was happening. Jaden felt the weight of their stares, the humiliation creeping up his spine. Before he could fully grasp what was happening, the officer grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his wrists. "You're under arrest for grand theft auto," the officer said, his words as casual as if he were discussing the weather. Jaden's mind reeled. "This is my car," he protested, his voice cracking under the strain. "Check the paperwork again. Call my mom, she'll tell you." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers seemed convinced that they had caught a criminal in the act. Jaden was shoved into the back of the squad car, his heart pounding with a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. The scene should have ended there. A young man unjustly arrested, his pride and dignity stripped away. But what happened next would change everything. As Jaden sat in the back of the police car, staring out at the small crowd that had gathered, a familiar figure appeared. A woman in her late 60s, clutching her purse tightly as she hurried toward the scene. It was Miss Angela, his neighbor from down the street. She had seen the commotion from her kitchen window and came rushing over, her gray curls bouncing with each determined step. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice firm despite her petite frame. "This young man stole this vehicle. the officer replied, his tone dismissive. Miss Angela raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms. Stow it. That car has been parked in his driveway for months. I see him driving it every day. It's his car. The officer hesitated for the first time, glancing at his partner. But before they could respond, another voice cut through the tension, a deep, authoritative tone that commanded attention. Is there a problem here? Everyone turned to see a tall man in a crisp suit stepping out of a sleek black car. Jaden recognized him instantly. It was Mr. Ellis, a local attorney who lived a few blocks over. He was known for standing up for the community and had a reputation for not backing down, especially when it came to matters of justice. And just like that, the power dynamic began to shift. What happened in the next 5 minutes would not only clear Jaden's name, but also serve as a powerful reminder of what can happen when a community refuses to stay silent in the face of injustice. Let me know if you'd like to adjust anything or expand further. Mr. Ellis approached the scene with an air of calm authority, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He carried himself with a kind of confidence that came from years of fighting battles in courtrooms and winning. As he reached the patrol car, his sharp eyes took in every detail, the officer's rigid posture, the neighbors whispering among themselves, and Jaden, sitting in the back of the squad car, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Officers, Mr. Ellis began, his voice steady but firm. What seems to be the issue here? This young man was caught driving a vehicle that doesn't belong to him. The officer replied curtly, still holding the registration papers in his hand. He's under arrest for auto theft. Mr. Ellis tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving the officer. And what evidence do you have to support that claim? The officer gestured to the papers. We're running his information now, but something doesn't add up. The car is too nice for. He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air like a thick cloud. Mr. Ellis's jaw tightened, but his tone remained measured. Too nice for what? Or perhaps I should say for whom? The officer bristled but said nothing. Behind him, the second officer seemed less certain, shifting uncomfortably as Mr. Ellis's words lingered. Miss Angela, still standing nearby, chimed in. This is ridiculous. That car has been in Jaden's family for years. His grandmother drove it to church every Sunday. She loved that car. Jaden, hearing her speak up, felt a small flicker of hope. Miss Angela wasn't just a neighbor. She was like a second grandmother to him. Her voice carried weight in the community, and if anyone could vouch for him, it was her. The officer holding the registration finally looked up from the papers. We're waiting for confirmation, but the VIN number came back flagged in our system. It was reported stolen 2 weeks ago. Jaden's eyes widened in disbelief. Stolen? That's impossible. I've had this car for years. My mom transferred the title to me after my grandma passed. Mr. Ellis turned back to the officer. Did you verify that with the DMV, or are you basing this solely on an outdated report? The officer hesitated, with following protocol. Protocol, Mr. Ellis repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. So instead of investigating properly, you handcuff an innocent young man and humiliate him in front of his entire neighborhood. The tension was palpable. A few more neighbors had gathered now, their murmurs growing louder. Some recorded the scene on their phones, capturing every word and gesture. The officers glanced at the crowd nervously, but didn't back down. Jaden's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. He knew the car wasn't stolen, but how could he prove it? His mom had all the original paperwork at home, but she was working a double shift at the hospital and wouldn't be home for hours. The thought of spending the night in a jail cell for a crime he didn't commit made his stomach churn. Officer, Mr. Ellis said, breaking the silence, I suggest you release this young man immediately. If you continue to detain him without sufficient evidence, I will ensure this department faces the full weight of the law. The lead officer narrowed his eyes. Are you threatening me? It's not a threat, Mr. Ellis replied smoothly. It's a promise. And if you're as confident in your actions as you claim to be, then you shouldn't have a problem letting me review the evidence myself. For a moment, it seemed like the officer might dig his heels in, but the growing crowd and the unwavering presence of Mr. Ellis seemed to chip away at his resolve. He handed the registration papers to Mr. Ellis with a reluctant scowl. As Mr. Ellis examined the documents, Jaden's mind drifted back to the day his grandmother gave him the car. He was only 16 then, freshly licensed and nervous about driving such a big vehicle. "Take care of her," Grandma had said, patting the hood affectionately. "She's got a lot of years left in her, just like me." Jaden had promised, and he kept that promise. He washed the car every weekend, changed the oil regularly, and even learned how to fix minor issues himself. The crowd of neighbors that had gathered earlier had mostly dispersed, but Miss Angela was still there, her arms crossed and her face set with a mixture of satisfaction and lingering anger. "Well, that man finally got what he deserved," she muttered, shaking her head. "I just hope the rest of them get caught too." Jaden nodded. The revelation that Grady had a partner within the DMV gnawed at him. It wasn't just about his car anymore. It was about every other family that could have been targeted by the same scheme. "Do you think they'll catch everyone involved?" he asked, looking up at Mr. Ellis. "They will," Mr. Ellis said firmly. "The evidence we've gathered is strong enough to unravel the entire operation. The police and the insurance companies have a lot of work to do, but justice will be served." Jaden's mom sighed, her exhaustion showing. "I just want to put this all behind us," she said softly. "We've been through enough." "We will, Mom," Jaden replied, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning of something better." When they got back home, the house felt different, lighter, as if the shadows of the past few days had finally lifted. Jaden's mom collapsed onto the couch, kicking off her shoes with a sigh of relief. Jaden sat beside her, leaning his head on her shoulder like he used to when he was little. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy this time. It was comforting, like the calm after a storm. "I'm proud of you, Jaden," his mom said eventually, breaking the silence. "You stayed strong through all of this. I know it wasn't easy." Jaden shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I had to. You taught me that." She smiled back, brushing a hand through his hair. "Your grandma would be proud too. She always said you'd grow into a man who stands up for what's right." The mention of his grandma brought a lump to Jaden's throat, but it was a good kind of ache, a reminder of the strength and love she had passed down to him. "I just wish she were here to see it," he said quietly. "She'd have handled this whole thing better than I did." His mom chuckled. "Oh, she would have given those officers a piece of her mind, that's for sure." Jaden laughed, the sound surprising him after everything that had happened. It felt good to laugh again, like he was reclaiming a part of himself that had been lost in the chaos. The next day, Jaden went out to the driveway to check on the car. It sat there, gleaming under the morning sun as if nothing had happened. He ran his hand along the hood, remembering all the times he and his grandma had driven to church, to family gatherings, or just around town for no reason at all. This car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a piece of his history, a symbol of everything his family had been through. Miss Angela came over with a plate of homemade cookies, her way of checking in without making it too obvious. "How's our hero doing today?" she asked, handing him the plate. Jaden grinned. "Hero might be a stretch, Miss Angela." "Don't sell yourself short," she said firmly. "You stood up for yourself, for your family, and for what's right. That's what heroes do." Jaden thanked her, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the cookies. Miss Angela might not have been his blood relative, but she was family all the same. Later that week, Mr. Ellis stopped by to give them an update. "Grady confessed to everything," he said, sitting at their kitchen table. "And the police have already arrested 2 more people connected to the scheme, including the DMV employee who was helping him. It's only a matter of time before the whole operation is dismantled." Jaden's mom let out a deep breath. "Thank God," she said. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "It won't," Mr. Ellis assured her. You've done more than your part in bringing this to light." As Mr. Ellis prepared to leave, he turned to Jaden. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Jaden," he said. "If you ever want to go into law, let me know. I'd be happy to mentor you." Jaden was taken aback, but managed a nod. "Thank you," he said. "I'll think about it." That night, as Jaden lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the uncertainty, it had all been overwhelming. But it had also taught him something important. He realized that no matter how unfair or difficult life could be, he had the power to stand up for himself and fight for what was right. And he wasn't alone. He had his mom, his neighbors, and even people like Mr. Ellis who believed in him. The next morning, Jaden decided to take the car out for a drive. As he cruised through the neighborhood, he felt a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in days. This car wasn't just his anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of family, and of justice. He rolled down the windows, letting the wind carry away the remnants of the past week's turmoil. The tension among the crowd escalated, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the air. Jaden's mom crossed her arms, her face a portrait of restrained fury. "If you're going to follow procedure, then I suggest you do it right. I'm going home to get the original title, and when I get back, I expect my son to be out of those cuffs." She didn't wait for a response. Turning on her heel, she headed back to her car, slamming the door before speeding off toward the house. Jaden watched her leave, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt. He hated that she had to come to his rescue, especially when she was already stretched thin, but her presence had shifted the power dynamic, and he felt a glimmer of hope that the truth would come to light. Meanwhile, Mr. Ellis was still scrutinizing the officers. "You might want to double-check your records," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "It wouldn't look good for your department if this turned out to be a clerical error, or worse, a case of racial profiling." The lead officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to his partner. "Call it in again. Make sure there's no mistake." The younger officer nodded, pulling out his radio and stepping a few feet away. As he relayed the information, Jaden caught snippets of the conversation, words like discrepancy, possible error, and need clarification. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in his mind. If the car wasn't actually flagged, why had they stopped him in the first place? And if it was flagged, who reported it stolen? The crowd continued to grow, and the murmurs turned into quiet discussions. Some people speculated about corruption in the police department, while others debated whether the stop had been racially motivated. Jaden tried to tune them out, but it was impossible not to hear the undercurrent of frustration and anger in their voices. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity, he was becoming a symbol for something much bigger. Miss Angela, always one to speak her mind, addressed the crowd directly. "This isn't just about Jaden," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "This is about how our young men are treated every single day. How they're judged before anyone even knows their story. It has to stop." Her words struck a chord, and several people nodded in agreement. One man called out, "We're with you, Jaden." Others shouted their support, creating a wave of solidarity that washed over him. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a sense of community, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. The second officer returned to the group, his face pale. He leaned in to whisper something to the lead officer, who stiffened immediately. They exchanged a tense glance, and Jaden knew something had shifted. The lead officer turned to Mr. Ellis, but before he could speak, Jaden's mom's car pulled up again. She stepped out, holding a folder filled with documents. "Here," she said, shoving the folder into the lead officer's hands. "The title, insurance, and maintenance records. Everything you need to prove that this car belongs to my son. Now let him go." The officer hesitated, clearly torn between admitting defeat and holding his ground. He opened the folder and flipped through the papers, his expression darkening with each passing second. Finally, he handed them to his partner, who reviewed them and nodded. "It checks out," the second officer said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "Then take those cuffs off my son," Jaden's mom demanded, her voice unwavering. The lead officer hesitated for a moment longer, but the weight of the evidence and the eyes of the crowd was too much. He pulled out the key and unlocked the cuffs, his movements stiff and reluctant. Jaden rubbed his wrists, relief flooding through him as he stepped out of the squad car. Before he could say a word, his mom pulled him into a tight hug. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're okay." But as the officers prepared to leave, something about their demeanor caught Jaden's attention. They seemed more nervous than angry, like they knew something they weren't saying. He turned to Mr. Ellis, who was watching them closely. "What's going on?" Jaden asked, his voice low. "Why does it feel like they're hiding something?" Mr. Ellis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on the officers as they got into their patrol car. "Because they are," he said finally. "This isn't over, Jaden. Not by a long shot." As the officers drove off, the tension in the air remained thick. The crowd lingered, many still recording or talking amongst themselves about what had just unfolded. Jaden stood next to his mom, still trying to process everything. His wrists stung slightly from the cuffs, but it was the lingering fear and humiliation that truly burned. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Mr. Ellis rested a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You held your composure well, young man. That's not easy in situations like this." Jaden nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "Mr. Ellis," he said hesitantly, "why would the car be flagged as stolen? It doesn't make sense." "That's exactly what we need to find out," Mr. Ellis replied, his tone serious. "Something about their story doesn't add up. A flagged VIN doesn't appear out of nowhere." Jaden's mom was already on the same page. "We're going to the station," she said firmly. "I want to see the report that claims my son's car was stolen." "Mom, you just got off work," Jaden said softly, worried about her. "You don't have to." She cut him off. "I don't care how tired I am. This is about more than just today. They tried to paint you as a thief in front of the whole neighborhood. We're not letting this slide." Miss Angela stepped forward, her expression fierce. "You need me to come with you. I've got nothing but time, and I'm not afraid to raise my voice if I have to." Jaden's mom gave her a grateful smile. "Thank you, Angela, but I got this. You've already done so much by standing up for Jaden." The crowd began to disperse, though many offered words of support before leaving. "We're with you," one neighbor said. "Keep fighting." Another added, "Let us know if you need anything. They can't get away with this." As they climbed into the car, Mr. Ellis joined them, insisting that they'd need legal backup if things escalated further. The ride to the station was tense and quiet, the only sounds coming from the hum of the engine and the occasional honk of passing cars. Jaden stared out the window, his mind replaying the events over and over. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a simple mistake. When they arrived at the police station, they were met with skeptical looks from the officers at the front desk. Jaden's mom wasted no time. "We're here to see the report that flagged my son's car as stolen," she said, her voice sharp and commanding. The desk officer raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a case number?" Mr. Ellis stepped forward. "We don't need a case number. This is a matter of public record, and as the legal representatives of the Carters, we're requesting immediate access." The officer hesitated, then picked up the phone and muttered something before gesturing for them to sit. "Someone will be out shortly." Minutes felt like hours as they waited. Jaden's knee bounced anxiously, and his mom tapped her foot, her exhaustion showing in the faint droop of her shoulders. Mr. Ellis remained calm, his briefcase resting on his lap as he observed everything around them. Finally, a plainclothes detective emerged, carrying a thin manila folder. "Carter family?" he asked, looking directly at Jaden and his mom. "That's us," Jaden's mom replied, standing up. The detective glanced at Mr. Ellis, who introduced himself, and then motioned for them to follow him into a small conference room. Once the door was closed, the detective laid the folder on the table and sat down. "This is the report," he said, opening the folder. "The vehicle was reported stolen 2 weeks ago by a Mr. Thomas Grady." Jaden frowned. The name didn't sound familiar. "Who's that?" he'd asked. The detective flipped through the pages. According to the report, Mr. Grady claimed ownership of the car and stated it was taken without his permission. "That's a lie," Jaden's mom snapped. "We've owned that car for over a decade. My mother bought it brand new, and it's been in our family ever since." Mr. Ellis leaned forward. Did Mr. Grady provide any proof of ownership when he filed this report? The detective hesitated. "No, but the VIA number matched his description of the vehicle, so the report was filed." Jaden felt his frustration boiling over. So just like that, no one bothered to verify anything. The detective's expression hardened slightly. "Look, son, it's not that simple. Sometimes reports are filed in good faith, and we follow up later if there are discrepancies." "Well, there's a big discrepancy," Jaden's mom said, her voice trembling with anger. "This man, whoever he is, lied, and because of your system's negligence, my son was treated like a criminal." Mr. Ellis placed a hand on her arm, a calming gesture. "Let's focus on the next steps. Detective, I'd like to know how Mr. Grady got the VIN number in the first place. That's not information you can just guess." The detective shifted uncomfortably. "That's a good question. I'll have to look into it." "You do that," Mr. Ellis said smoothly. "And in the meantime, I'd like a copy of this report. We'll be conducting our own investigation." The detective hesitated, clearly unhappy with the situation, but ultimately nodded. "I'll have the front desk prepare one for you." As they left the station with the report in hand, the unease in Jaden's chest grew heavier. Someone out there had gone out of their way to target him and his family. But why? And how had they gotten the VIN number? Back in the car, his mom clenched the folder tightly in her lap. "This isn't over," she muttered. "Whoever this Grady is, he's going to regret ever trying to mess with us." Jaden glanced at Mr. Ellis, who seemed deep in thought. "What are you thinking?" Jaden asked. Mr. Ellis gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm thinking we're closer to the truth than they want us to be, and when we find it, karma won't just knock on their door, it'll tear it down." As the car pulled into their driveway, Jaden's mind was racing. Mr. Ellis's confidence was reassuring, but the fact remained. Someone had gone to great lengths to put him in this situation, and it wasn't just about a car. The weight of the unanswered questions pressed on his chest like a stone. Who was Thomas Grady? How did he even know about the car? And why had the police acted so quickly, with so little evidence? Jaden's mom turned off the engine, but didn't move to get out. She sat gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "I'm not letting this go," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "No one gets to attack my family like this." Jaden nodded silently. He was angry too, but seeing his mom so shaken made him feel even worse. She'd already worked so hard to provide for him, and now this, it wasn't fair. Mr. Ellis broke the silence. "Before we make our next move, I suggest we dig deeper into this Thomas Grady. If we can figure out his motive, it might shed light on how he got the VIN number in the first place." Jaden's mom finally turned to look at him. "How do we do that? We don't even know who this man is." Mr. Ellis gave her a calm, determined look. "Leave that part to me. I have some resources that can help. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping the car parked somewhere secure, just in case." The suggestion made Jaden's stomach twist. The idea that someone might come after the car again, or even worse, escalate things, felt like a weight pressing down on him. But he nodded. "We can park it in the garage," he said. "I'll make sure it's locked up tight." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Jaden tried to focus on his homework, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation with the police. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officer's skeptical expressions, felt the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists. He could hear the whispers of the neighbors, the distant clicks of phone cameras. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about his name, his dignity. Around midnight, just as he was finally starting to doze off, his phone buzzed on his nightstand. Groggily, he reached for it, expecting a message from one of his friends checking in after the incident. But when he opened the notification, his blood ran cold. It was an anonymous email with no subject line, and inside was a single sentence. Asterisk, you don't deserve what you have. Asterisk. His heart pounded as he stared at the screen. Who would send something like this? Was it connected to the car? He jumped out of bed and hurried to his mom's room, knocking softly but urgently. She opened the door, looking half asleep but immediately alert when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Jaden handed her the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "I just got this," he said. "I think it's about the car." His mom's expression hardened as she read the message. "This has gone too far," she muttered, grabbing her own phone. "We're calling Mr. Ellis right now." Before she could dial, Jaden stopped her. "Wait, what if this makes things worse? What if they're trying to scare us into backing down?" His mom hesitated, clearly torn. "Jaden, we can't just ignore this. This isn't just about the car anymore. It's about someone targeting us. We need to fight back." Jaden nodded, but a nagging thought tugged at the back of his mind. The email felt personal, almost as if the sender knew him. But how? He didn't have enemies, at least none that he could think of. The next morning, Mr. Ellis came by early, a look of grim determination on his face. "I had someone run a check on Thomas Grady overnight," he said, stepping into the kitchen where Jaden and his mom were sitting. "And you're not going to believe this." Jaden's mom leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "What did you find?" The detective hesitated, clearly unhappy with the situation, but ultimately nodded. "I'll have the front desk prepare one for you." As they left the station with the report in hand, the unease in Jaden's chest grew heavier. Someone out there had gone out of their way to target him and his family. But why? And how had they gotten the VIN number? Back in the car, his mom clenched the folder tightly in her lap. "This isn't over," she muttered. "Whoever this Grady is, he's going to regret ever trying to mess with us." Jaden glanced at Mr. Ellis, who seemed deep in thought. "What are you thinking?" Jaden asked. Mr. Ellis gave him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm thinking we're closer to the truth than they want us to be. And when we find it, karma won't just knock on their door, it'll tear it down." As the car pulled into their driveway, Jaden's mind was racing. Mr. Ellis's confidence was reassuring, but the fact remained. Someone had gone to great lengths to put him in this situation, and it wasn't just about a car. The weight of the unanswered questions pressed on his chest like a stone. Who was Thomas Grady? How did he even know about the car? And why had the police acted so quickly, with so little evidence? Jaden's mom turned off the engine, but didn't move to get out. She sat gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "I'm not letting this go," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "No one gets to attack my family like this." Jaden nodded silently. He was angry too, but seeing his mom so shaken made him feel even worse. She'd already worked so hard to provide for him, and now this, it wasn't fair. Mr. Ellis broke the silence. "Before we make our next move, I suggest we dig deeper into this Thomas Grady. If we can figure out his motive, it might shed light on how he got the VIN number in the first place." Jaden's mom finally turned to look at him. "How do we do that? We don't even know who this man is." Mr. Ellis gave her a calm, determined look. "Leave that part to me. I have some resources that can help. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping the car parked somewhere secure, just in case." The suggestion made Jaden's stomach twist. The idea that someone might come after the car again, or even worse, escalate things, felt like a weight pressing down on him. But he nodded. "We can park it in the garage," he said. "I'll make sure it's locked up tight." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Jaden tried to focus on his homework, but his mind kept drifting back to the confrontation with the police. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officer's skeptical expressions, felt the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists. He could hear the whispers of the neighbors, the distant clicks of phone cameras. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about his name, his dignity. Around midnight, just as he was finally starting to doze off, his phone buzzed on his nightstand. Groggily, he reached for it, expecting a message from one of his friends checking in after the incident. But when he opened the notification, his blood ran cold. It was an anonymous email with no subject line, and inside was a single sentence. Asterisk, you don't deserve what you have. Asterisk. His heart pounded as he stared at the screen. Who would send something like this? Was it connected to the car? He jumped out of bed and hurried to his mom's room, knocking softly but urgently. She opened the door, looking half asleep, but immediately alert when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Jaden handed her the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "I just got this," he said. "I think it's about the car." His mom's expression hardened as she read the message. "This has gone too far," she muttered, grabbing her own phone. "We're calling Mr. Ellis right now." Before she could dial, Jaden stopped her. "Wait, what if this makes things worse? What if they're trying to scare us into backing down?" His mom hesitated, clearly torn. "Jaden, we can't just ignore this. This isn't just about the car anymore. It's about someone targeting us. We need to fight back." Jaden nodded, but a nagging thought tugged at the back of his mind. The email felt personal, almost as if the sender knew him. But how? He didn't have enemies, at least none that he could think of. The next morning, Mr. Ellis came by early, a look of grim determination on his face. "I had someone run a check on Thomas Grady overnight," he said, stepping into the kitchen where Jaden and his mom were sitting. "And you're not going to believe this." Jaden's mom leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. "What did you find?" But now, none of that seemed to matter. His grandmother's cherished car was being reduced to nothing more than a suspicious vehicle, and he was being treated like a criminal. The injustice of it all gnawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. Miss Angela wasn't as restrained. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed, glaring at the officers. "You're targeting him because of the color of his skin. You wouldn't have stopped him if he was some white boy in a fancy car." The second officer shifted uncomfortably again, clearly uneasy with how the situation was unfolding. "Ma'am, that's not true," he said weakly, but his words rang hollow. Before anyone could respond, another car pulled up, a sleek silver sedan with tinted windows. Jaden recognized it immediately. It was his mom. She must have seen the commotion on her way home from work and rushed over. Still wearing her scrubs, she stepped out of the car, her expression a mix of worry and anger. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp as she marched toward the squad car. Jaden's heart ached seeing her like this. She was exhausted from her shift, and now she had to deal with this mess. But at the same time, he felt a surge of relief. If anyone could set the record straight, it was her. "This is my son," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "And that is our car. What is he being accused of?" "Ma'am, we have reason to believe," the lead officer began, but she cut him off. "Reason to believe asterisk what asterisk," she snapped. "That we don't belong here. That my son isn't allowed to drive a car that's been in our family for years." Her words hit like a hammer, and for the first time, the lead officer looked genuinely uncomfortable. He glanced at his partner, who avoided his gaze. Mr. Ellis, still holding the registration papers, stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter, it's good to see you. I was just explaining to the officers that there seems to be a serious misunderstanding. This car is clearly registered in your son's name, and unless they have concrete evidence to the contrary, they have no grounds to detain him." Jaden's mom nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I have the title and insurance documents at home," she said. "I'll go get them right now." The lead officer held up a hand. "That won't be necessary, ma'am. We're still verifying the information." "You had more than enough time," Mr. Ellis countered. "And if this so-called investigation isn't resolved in the next 5 minutes, we'll be filing a formal complaint." The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still recording every second. The officers exchanged a tense look, and for the first time, Jaden felt the scales tipping in his favor. But the question remained, how had his car been flagged as stolen in the first place? And who had filed the report? Deep down, Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone realized. Jaden's mom glanced at him through the car's rear window, her expression softening for just a moment. She mouthed the words, "It's going to be okay." But he wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. She turned her focus back to the officers, her fiery determination taking over once again. "Officer," she said firmly, "I'm not leaving here until you explain exactly why my son is being treated like a criminal." The lead officer looked at her, then at Mr. Ellis, then back at the growing crowd. His confidence seemed to falter, but he quickly adjusted his stance, doubling down. The vehicle in question matches the description of a stolen car. The VIN number came up flagged during our routine check. Until we can confirm otherwise, it remains in our system as stolen property. And you've made no effort to verify that the report is inaccurate. Mr. Ellis interjected, holding the registration papers up for emphasis. Because these documents clearly state the car is registered to Jaden Carter. Your system being outdated or improperly updated isn't his problem. The second officer, visibly less confident than his partner, took a small step forward. "Look, we don't want this to escalate further. If the paperwork checks out, we'll sort this out and let him go. But we have to follow procedure." Miss Angela scoffed loudly. "Your procedure is tearing this boy's life apart for no reason. If it were anyone else, they wouldn't be sitting in handcuffs right now. This is harassment, plain and simple."